Hello. As a country, we've lost the courage to say the obvious, that government can't do everything, that the state can't fix every problem. So said the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, this week, after the Chancellor relish-making promise after promise of extra spending. My guest on Political Thinking this week, a conversation with, rather than a newsy interrogation of someone who shapes our political thinking, is the man who will have to work out what government might not do if the Tories return to power. He's the Shadow Chancellor, the former Welfare Secretary Mel Stride, who recently promised that never again would his party pledge tax cuts without spelling out exactly. Mel Stride, welcome to Political.
Thank you, Nick. Good to be here.
You gave a speech the other day which struck me. You talked about the importance of thoughtfulness in politics. Why did you feel the need to say it?
Because I think there are dangers associated by not being thoughtful. Look, we all want to be frivolous, enjoy our lives and get excited about things, and there's room for that. But if you're talking about an economy and how you run an economy, it's really important that it's done in the right way. Otherwise, you can end up in a bad place. So I think we need to spend more time thinking, for example, about things like fiscal responsibility, whether the numbers add up, whether it's realistic you can just endlessly promise to spend ever and ever greater amounts of money without actually properly explaining how it's going to be funded. So that's what I mean. And I think we need to try and get back to that. It's a struggle in this world of TikTok and social media, and everybody gets their news on the go on their phone and all of that kind of stuff. But that's what we need to fight for.
Yeah, you said some years ago that you were nostalgic for a sort of older and better style of politics. Is that what you mean? Before, as it were, there was a need for an instant headline and an instant soundbite.
Yeah, what politics ultimately has got to be about is a kind of pursuit of the truth, isn't it? So that's what you try and do on the Today programme every morning, is get to the bottom of what the facts are, what the truth really is. And it's only on that basis that you can make rational policy or go to the polling booth and vote for a particular party if it's been really properly, truthfully laid out about what it is you stand for and what it is you're suggesting. And so I think we need to fight for that space, that thoughtful space in the public square.
What's so interesting about this is in the speech, you said our modern digital age has many advantages, but in some way it has ushered in the death of what we might call the age of thoughtfulness. I mean, are you saying to people listening, look, politics these days is all too rarely an argument between people who've actually thought through what they're saying?
Well, I think that the most important thing is that when important issues are in play, that people have the opportunity to really weigh up the arguments based on, the evidence, etc. And if it gets the space to do that gets narrowed down to a tiny sliver, a flicker on the screen of your phone or whatever it may be, then it's quite difficult to do that. And you see that with fake news, for example. By the time some fake news has gone halfway around the world, the truth has barely had time to put its trousers on. OK, and I think that's a difficult environment for politicians to navigate. But I think it's down to all of us, actually, to try and make that space in order to come up with the rational answers and decisions. And it's important for the future of the country that we spend time trying to do that.
There'll be plenty of people listening, watching, saying, hear to that. But there may be others going, this is sort of hopeless nostalgia. I mean, you're in your early 60s, I'm in my early 60s as well. It's just not going to change. And they'll say another more political point, which is you haven't got the time, Mel Stride. You're in trouble as a Conservative Party at the moment. I remember talking to you on election night when I was hosting the results programme on Radio 4.
You told me I was going to lose my seat, Nick. And you were wrong.
Did you think...
It was close, but you were actually wrong.
Yeah, we were
I won by 61 in the end.
Did you think we might be right when I said that?
Oh, of course, I didn't know. I think it was just past 10 o'clock, wasn't it? The poll had come out and you said, Mel Stride, they say you're going to lose your seat. And I said, well, let's wait and see, Nick. But of course, it was in the balance. It was a difficult moment.
Well, you did more, actually, because I listened back to it the other day. You actually started to give thanks for the great honour, you said, of being an MP. It seemed to me you were rehearsing.
You thought I was half out the door.
Yeah, you were rehearsing your defeat speech.
Well, rumours of my death have been greatly exaggerated, as they say. Yes.
But talking of political deaths, we are at a stage, and maybe this is why you haven't got time to think as much as you want, where people are starting to talk about the death of the Conservative Party. Do you have to accept it could happen? Not that it will. Obviously, you're going to say it's not going to happen, but it could if you get it wrong.
It's a really tough moment for our party. A huge electoral defeat at the general election, and in the local elections we've suffered very badly too. But no, I am an optimist, and I totally believe that we can come back, and indeed more than that, we can come back and win the next election.
I was struck when I was reading in about you. Who are Mel Stride Shadow Chancellor's political heroes? And one of them I have walked past hundreds of times, maybe thousands in fact, without paying much attention to him, I have to confess, is memorialised in a statue outside the Ministry of Defence.
Yes.
Why is he your hero?
Because he came back against all the odds, and he was resourceful, and we were fighting the Japanese in Burma in the jungle, and he had a ragtag army that needed to be brought together, and he showed incredible leadership. Because what he did with every single person under his command was to explain what they could do rather than dwell on the size of the challenge. And he was a great motivator, and he did great things. And I think, for me, he's a hero because it's about leadership. And he wrote a whole book on it, actually, after the war.
Yeah, on that statue.
On leadership. Yep.
Of Field Marshal William Swin, Viscount Slim of the 14th Army in Burma, is the slogan, defeat into victory. And the National Army Museum says he showed pragmatic skill and quiet charisma. Is that your answer? Is that your answer
there might
to those?
be a Mel Stride statue in the future that says quiet charisma and whatever. Well, who knows? Maybe.
I wonder if that was your answer to those who just, and I'd say this gently, say, Mel Stride's not the most kind of zippy and exciting and politician with enormous amounts of public flair.
Look, it's back to thoughtfulness, Nick. You know, if you're going to solve the kind of problems that our country faces, right, you can jump up and down and get headlines. You can claim to pull some magic lever that suddenly solves all the problems and make yourself exciting in that way. We have to get back to really looking at the deep, some would say intractable challenges our country faces to create that more productive, much higher growing economy that we need to meet the kind of challenges as a country that we're leaning into.
So look, I was teasing you, but is that your answer to people? And you know they're there. They're looking at the opinion polls now. They're showing the Tories in some polls below 20%, 18% on one Politico polling average. And they go, we haven't got time for thoughtful. We haven't got time for considered. We haven't got time for, forgive me, boring. What we need is...
No, but saying that we have to be thoughtful and do the hard yards of working out how to come up with solutions to fundamentally rewire our economy, which is a big job and it needs to be done. In the way, in fact, that Attlee did it after the war. I wouldn't be doing it in the way that Attlee did it, incidentally. And Thatcher certainly did in the 1970s. We're at that kind of stage in our political history, and that does need that deep thought. But that's not the same thing, Nick, as saying that we don't need to be out there sticking it to the opposition, out there getting the headlines, out there expressing our values, and yes, on some occasions, our policies too at this stage. But we have to be realistic. We've lost connection with the British people. On the day of that general election, when my majority had gone down from over 20,000 to 17,000 to 61 votes, the visceral anger towards my party was palpable.
Yeah. Let's talk about the values, because you mentioned the values, and explore what this series tries to do on political thinking, which is to look at what underlies the values of people who shape our political life. Would you describe yourself? Seems to me, reading your story, you're a child of Thatcher. Not literally, I stress, but of her era.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that the right way of looking at you and what drives you?
I think that was a particular moment in our history from which we can learn a great deal, because we come through the 70s, as you know, into the winter of discontent and huge challenges, inflation, trade unions, strikes and all that kind of stuff. And here we had somebody who had done that deep thinking, thoughtful thinking that I'm talking about. She'd done it between 75 and 79 and came up with an approach that was transformational. Now, I grew up in that environment. So I managed to get into Oxford University, got a place there, the first in my family to go to university. My mum and dad had left school at 15 and 14 years old. And I ran as far and as fast as I possibly could with that opportunity. And I never looked back, not once. And after that, I set up my own business around the kitchen table, getting the ideas together, climbing those metaphorical mountains with teams of other people in an environment that Margaret Thatcher had created, a zeitgeist that was about opportunity, aspiration and achievement. Now, we've got to try and get that back. And I'll give you one visual metaphor for this, Nick, because I think it's important. That image of her and Richard Branson going down the Thames, okay, with the sunlight playing on the water like an endless stream of opportunity. I can see it in my head now. That's what we've got to recapture. And that's why I'm so optimistic for our country, because we can do it.
Are you saying a young Mel Stride, the child of two people who you say left school, one at 15, one at 14. I think your mum came from a pretty poor background, your dad too. They gave you, did they, a sense that Thatcher was their route out of poverty, their route to a better life? Did your parents see themselves as working class? Would they have grown up thinking of themselves as Conservatives, or was that part of the change that Margaret
I don't
Thatcher
think we
brought?
ever would have labelled ourselves as anything back in those days, actually. I see my parents as just thoroughly decent people that wanted a happy family, a loving family, wanted to provide for them, had a father that was clearly very ambitious and went out and set up his businesses, his small businesses. And it was a journey, and we were all kind of on that journey. But as I say, Nick, it was in an environment of kind of popular capitalism in a way,
Yeah,
in which the zeitgeist...
You ended up driving a red Mercedes sports car in your 20s.
Oh, is that right?
I mean,
Gosh, you've dug around a bit to find that.
We have. I mean,
who spilt the beans on that, Nick?
This is the loads of money era, isn't it?
Well, I don't know about that, but it was a rather nice car back in the day. No, I set up my business after university, and it was it was exhibitions, conferences, and publishing. And I built that business from scratch here, and then I went over to the United States with it and sold that business a bit later on. But I had a great time doing that. It was, a really valuable thing to do. And I think when I started, which was in the later 80s, there was that zeitgeist that really valued that kind of activity. It was cool to be doing that. And I think we've lost that to some degree, and we've got to get it back.
Now, what's so interesting is that Kemi Badenoch posed a fundamental question, didn't she, this week? After the spending review, she asked that question I mentioned in my introduction. We've lost the courage, she said, to say the obvious, that government can't do everything, that the state can't fix every problem. Now, I can hardly now say, well, what are you going to scrap then? Because you've just said you want time and you want to be thoughtful. But what do you have to start exploring? What are the questions you have to start examining
I think
in order to address that point?
So I think there's an argument that has to be won that has not been won, which is this idea that the only way you get better public services is to tip ever more money into them. We have to land the message that we need to have more efficient services rather than necessarily constantly putting more money in behind them. And I think that's the kind of building block, if you like, from where you can move forward in that sense.
Is
but I
there
think
a
that's
difficulty with that, though, that politicians for years, I mean decades, have been saying, oh yeah, we've got to just get a more efficient health service. It's got bigger and bigger and bigger. I saw the striking figure this week that it is now, the budget of the NHS is now bigger than the GDP of Portugal. I mean, it's staggering, the size of it.
Absolutely.
But isn't it too easy to say we just be more efficient, we'll get rid of waste, we'll get rid of some quangos?
Yes, it's very easy to say.
choices.
But this is where your thoughtfulness comes in, isn't it?
Yeah.
We need a proper debate to really probe these arguments. You can't just stand up and say, well, I'll slash spending left, right and centre and it'll all be fine. But look, when I was Secretary of State at Work and Pensions, that is a department that employs 90,000 people, okay? It receives every day 20,000 pieces of correspondence, which back in the day were being opened and read by individuals, by staff. We now have AI in that department, a project that I was working on called Whitemail that reads that stuff in about an hour or two, and it's better than that. It spots patterns and it works out the priority people, the most vulnerable people that are writing in, and prioritises them. That is an example of how you can do an awful lot more, actually, with an awful lot less. And that's what we need to be getting sort of bedded in right across government.
But let me put the counter-argument to you. The counter-argument to all this is, well, hold on, there's a whole series of things driving government, the state, if you like, to get bigger, not just here but around the world. The Office for Budget Responsibility every so often looks at the big long-term drivers of public spending and borrowing, don't they?
Yeah.
An ageing population costs more in terms of health, costs more in terms of benefits. Climate change, there is the cost of net zero as well as the mitigation for things like flood risk. Geopolitical tensions, they point out, wars and so on, interruption of trade. So on their last calculation done last year, they said over the next 50 years, public spending will rise from 45% of the economy, of GDP, to 60%. if nothing changes. So aren't you going to have to run very fast and still go backwards?
Yeah, we're swimming against a tide. That's undoubtedly true. Look, we've got a top-heavy ageing population. We've got the geopolitical challenges you've identified. An extra % on GDP on defence is £25 billion. We've got intergenerational challenges around how do we have a fair deal for younger people and so on. And all of that's going to need a very different economy. And now that different economy is going to have to address a number of different issues if it is to grow at the kind of pre-global financial crisis trend or better. And that is around tax, it's around the size of the state, it's around skills, it's around getting net migration down, it's around gripping welfare and the budgets in welfare, it's around supply side things about building houses and railways and roads and energy costs and much more. So a big piece
could
of
it
work.
also be about politicians being brave enough to say, we won't do this anymore? This thing that you think government should do. Well, we were thinking when we prepared this interview, there are all sorts of things that government doesn't do that you might assume they would do, and they do in other countries. Lifeboats, for example. Other countries, they're provided by the state, but they're not here. Nobody says, well, let's nationalise the lifeboats. Hospices, that's more controversial. But there are things that society does and government doesn't. Are the Conservatives brave enough to say, right, we're going to identify some things and just say, you don't get this anymore?
We will have a fundamental look at the way in which the state works, the way public services work, and all of those questions and many more will be in the mix. But what I think I'm saying to you today is that there is no quick, glib, 1 second answer to that. It needs real deep thinking to come up with the solution. That we need to go back to the drawing board on all these fundamental issues and do that deep thinking to come up with those solutions. And the prize will be enormous if we can do it. Do you know, if we just got back to the trend growth that we had up to 2008 and the global financial crisis, the economy would be 25% bigger than it is today.
That, incidentally, is something the Chancellor herself, Rachel Reeves, often points to, isn't it? Getting back to the trend rate of growth.
We could get into what she's done. And
let's get into something
not the right thing.
You both agree on, and she talks about it a lot, and you talked about it the other day, which is you don't think that Liz Truss, how shall I put it gently, got it quite right. Now, I was fascinated by your speech, because when I picked up my newspapers, it says Mel Stride, Shadow Chancellor, says sorry for Liz Truss's infamous mini-budget. And then I read the speech. Didn't say sorry. Didn't in fact say the word Liz Truss. Is she like sort of Voldemort? She can't be named.
No, of course not. But what I was saying was something very profound and serious, which is that that mini-budget at the back end of 2022 was a huge mistake, and it came with consequences. And to reflect on the fact that that is something that we will never, ever do again. Now, what was it that went wrong? Well, what went wrong was tens of billions of unfunded tax cuts into a fairly inflationary environment that unsettled the bond markets, and the rest, as they say, is history. And the lesson there...
You can say it was Liz Truss's budget.
Well, clearly it was Liz Truss's budget.
And you can say sorry, because everyone said you were saying sorry.
Look, what matters is reflecting
Why
on
can't
the
you
fact...
say sorry?
Well, no, I think
I don't
the
want to play a
important
game
thing...
with you.
No, well, let's not do that then. Let's not do that, Nick. If you don't want to do it, then there's no need to do it, is there?
No, but I'm intrigued. I'm asking why
well,
it's a difficult word to say, because Kevin Oldenrate's Shadow Housing Secretary said, I'm happy to say sorry this week, and you're evidently feel it's a sort of media trap.
What I am saying, which is very clear, is that a mistake was made and putting one's hands up to that. And I talked in my speech about showing contrition and being honest and upfront about what happened and owning that. But at the same time, making a very clear statement that never again will fiscal responsibility be anything other than deep within the DNA of my party, as it has otherwise always been. And I think in a world in which you've got a Labour Party that's messing up the economy, we'd have a long chat about that, and the Reform Party who are running around promising the earth with no credible plan as to how they're going to deliver all of that stuff. We have to be the grown-up party that re-establishes our credibility around fiscal responsibility going forward, and that's what I'm absolutely determined to do.
Is it perhaps awkward, because it must be rather tempting for Mel Stride, who at the time of that budget was chair of the Treasury Select Committee, all-party committee in the House of Commons, and warned against the budget. Must be quite tempting for you to sit here in a T-shirt saying, I told you so. Your difficulty is your leader didn't. Your leader said, "We're going for growth in a big way," she said in the week of the Liz Truss infamous mini-budget. The Shadow Home Secretary said, "It's great to see sterling strengthening." Your Deputy Richard Fuller said, "The mini-budget announcements will incentivise young people to take risks with their money." The Shadow Business Secretary praised. All these people praise the budget. Now you say it's, "Oh, never again, it'll never happen."
Well, Nick, I'm the one on your show, right? And you're quite right. Before it happened,
You were right, they were all wrong.
I warned against it before it happened. I warned against it when it happened, and I've spoken very clearly about it since. But look, we're under new leadership. And what I would say about that time is two things. One is the aspiration to have a higher growing economy, lower tax economy, controlling public spending and so on, is absolutely, totally and utterly right. But the second thing I would say, which I did set out in my speech actually, is if you look at what happened there, I think it was bred of a broader frustration that we for too long had managerial incrementalism as our lodestar for the economy. So for decades we'd had that growth rate that was relatively anemic, and nobody had come up with a radical approach, a responsible radical approach to actually address the issue. And that was the frustration, I think, that drove the actions at that time, the haste with which it was done and so on. And that, I think, is part of the lesson there.
It's interesting. I made a documentary for Radio 4 about how that budget was drawn up, speaking to insiders. And some of them said to Liz Truss at that time, "This is all fine. Cutting taxes, fine. Speeding up planning, cutting regulation." The current government wants to do some of that and is trying to do some of that. Yes. The problem is you haven't shown how you'll pay for it. You need to come up with the spending cuts. Is that broadly the message? In fact, had Liz Truss come up with some spending cuts, you wouldn't have objected
it
to it.
It may well have been very different. Look, it often get back to Margaret Thatcher for a minute. Now, Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson did bring taxes down, but the sequencing was important. So the first dragon to slay was inflation back in that time. And once they'd done that and they got the fiscal space to cut taxes, they did it in a responsible way by showing how it could be funded. And that is the only way to do it. So I think the mistake was that it was, as I say, tens of billions of tax cuts, no explanation of how it was going to be funded. The OBR were kept out of the whole equation as well, and it basically spooked the markets, and then you're in trouble. So we will never ever, under my watch, under this Conservative Party, go anywhere near that again.
You were asked about Kemi Badenoch at the end of that speech, and you got a bit of a flack, didn't you? Because you said, "Look, she'll get better."
Well, that was one little snippet. You know, the sugar tongs went into what I said, and they picked out the little strand that made the interesting headline. Yeah. What I actually said was that being leader of the opposition is probably the toughest job in politics. We all learn as we go through our political lives, of course. I also referred, to get back to Margaret Thatcher again, that when she became leader in 1975, there were many criticisms about her. She wasn't good enough at the dispatch box, her hair wasn't right, the pitch of her voice wasn't right, the clothes she wore weren't right, and so on and so forth. And it wasn't really, actually, until she'd won that election, and some would argue even beyond that, when the internal tensions within the party and the cabinet were kind of resolved by the time of the 1983 election, that she really arrived as a fully formed politician who appeared to be unassailable. So we're all on a journey, but Kemi has really key strengths as a person, and I did speak to those in that at the end of that speech.
It's interesting you talk about a journey. We were at Oxford at a similar time, not quite the same time.
I remember you in the Union Bar on many occasions.
No. Yeah. But what's quite interesting is I talked to a few of your friends from that period. I said,
"Oh no,
he wasn't a Thatcherite. He had Ted Heath to come and speak at the Oxford Union, to praise the European Union. And you were, of course, a Remainer, not a Brexiteer. You had Helmut Schmidt, the former Chancellor of Germany.
I did.
He's a lefty, they said to me.
No, that's certainly not true. And I think what I've taken you through in terms of my approach to the economy and what I've termed responsible, radical reform speaks to lower taxes. It speaks to a smaller state. It speaks to getting net migration down. It speaks to looking at our skills offer, getting on top of welfare, freeing up all the supply side constraints that the economy has. And that is a pretty radical agenda.
All government, indeed every human benefit and enjoyment, every virtue and every prudent act, is founded in compromise and barter. A quote from Edmund Burke,
Yeah.
which you proposed in a debate. You're a compromiser and a barterer, aren't you, by instinct?
No, I don't mind being labelled as a pragmatist. I think that if you want to create a society which is harmonious and people can get on together, I think you have to listen very carefully to all views in a thoughtful way, as we've discussed. So I don't resile from that.
How do you successfully, though, take on someone who isn't like that at all, Nigel Farage? Someone who effortlessly dominates news bulletins, who has a line for every moment, and a line that often appeals to your natural supporters.
So you shine a light of truth on people like Reform, and you expose what it is that they are offering, and on the economy, to say, for example, that you will take everybody out of income tax up to £20,000 worth of earnings, which the IFS says will cost between 50 and 80 billion pounds. You explain to people that that is the equivalent of about a third to a half of what we spend on the health service every year with its 1.3 million employees. And then you say to the public, you've got to ask Nigel and co, how are they going to fund that? And if they can't answer that problem, we were talking about in the mini budget a minute ago, you're going to end up, if you have Reform in government, in a very, very dangerous place in terms of the economy.
In the world in which you have said people often look, just glance at a headline on the phone, and that explanation, that challenge to Reform, took, let's guess, 45 seconds.
Yes.
You think you can win that?
I think that is a challenge, but I do believe that we can. I'm optimistic about our ability to do that. But the critical thing is we have time. Now, Nigel Farage has got to keep this spinning plates act that he has, right, up for another 4 to 4.5 years. OK? So let's talk again in 4 years' time and see where they are.
Hold your nerve is your message to your party.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean not being vigorous. We have to fight tooth and nail, OK, against Reform and against this government and so on. Got to be an effective opposition, express our values. We've got to do all of that. Strain at every single fibre. But we've also got to accept that some getting back traction with the electorate is going to take time, and we have to hold our nerve.
I want to end this interview by inviting you to be thoughtful about your principal opponent. We know why you object to her. You think she's spending too much and taxing too much and borrowing too much, and you've said that. Yeah. What do you admire about Rachel Reeves?
I admire somebody who has risen to that position in our political firmament. I admire somebody who has shown the resilience to take the brickbats, and let's face it, she's not had an easy time, and let's set aside whether that's her fault or whatever. I admire that. I've only sat down with Rachel a couple of times, but we sort of sat down and had a cup of tea and a chat, and she's a likeable, nice person. I have no issues with her at that level. So
she's a chess champion, and you play chess, don't you?
Yeah, I think she beat me pretty thoroughly at chess. Probably fool's mate in about 5 moves, I think, Nick, would be the result of that. So I will not be challenging her at chess. And I do admire, actually, that she was a chess champion, because I did used to play quite a lot, and it's a great game, and it's a great skill if you can be very good at it.
Mel Stride, Shadow Chancellor, thanks very much indeed for joining me on Political Thinking.
Thank you, Nick. It's been a great pleasure.